Here is something that almost no one knows, and that changes everything about how you think about human history. The oldest building ever discovered was not built by the Egyptians. It was not built in Mesopotamia. It was not built by any civilization that appears in our history books, because the civilization that built it does not appear in our history books. It was built by people who, according to everything we believed about human development until very recently, should not have been capable of building it. It was built approximately 11,600 years ago, at a site in what is now southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, and it is so far beyond what we thought prehistoric humans were capable of that. Its discovery in 1994 sent a shockwave through the entire field of archaeology that has not yet fully settled. The T-shaped limestone pillars at Göbekli Tepe weigh up to 20 tons each. They are carved with extraordinary bas-relief animal imagery. They're arranged in precise circular formations, and they were built by people who, at the time of construction, had not yet invented agriculture, had not yet built permanent villages, and had not yet developed any of the social and organizational innovations that we associate with civilized life. According to the standard model of human development, cities and monuments come after agriculture. Göbekli Tepe came before agriculture. The entire sequence we believed in was wrong. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were the inheritors of something. They were not the beginning of human sophistication. They were a remnant. And what they were a remnant of is one of the most important and least answered questions in the entire study of human history. The thesis of this video is not that there were 7 literally identical advanced civilizations stretching back millions of years, each leaving no trace. That is not what the evidence shows. What the evidence does show is something more interesting and more unsettling than that. It shows that human civilizational development has not been a straight line from primitive to advanced. It has been interrupted, repeatedly, by catastrophes so severe that they reset everything, and that the world we live in now is not the first world that human beings built. It is one in a series. And the question of how many times we have started over, and how completely and why, is a question that the evidence is only beginning to answer. By the time this story is fully told, you will understand why so many independent cultures across the world share memories of a great flood, why myths of a golden age before the current one appear in ancient texts from every civilization, why the archaeological record shows, repeatedly and in multiple locations, traces of human sophistication that our current timeline of development cannot easily explain, and why the pattern of collapse that has destroyed every previous era of human civilization is a pattern that continues today. We are not the beginning, we are the latest, and how we got here is one of the strangest stories ever told. To understand where we begin, we need to understand where humanity nearly ended. 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano erupted on the island of Sumatra in what is now Indonesia. The volcano was Mount Toba, and the eruption was the largest volcanic event in the past 2 million years. The volume of material ejected was approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash and debris. For comparison, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens ejected approximately 1 cubic kilometre. Toba ejected nearly 3,000 times more material. The immediate effects were catastrophic. The ash fall from the eruption covered approximately 20 million square kilometres, a significant portion of South and Southeast Asia, in a layer of volcanic ash. The Toba ash layer has been found in sediment records across the Indian Ocean, in ice cores from Greenland, and in geological deposits across a vast area of the Old World, but the lasting effects were worse than the immediate catastrophe. The sulfur dioxide released into the stratosphere by the eruption formed sulfuric acid aerosols that blocked sunlight globally. The resulting volcanic winter is estimated to have reduced global temperatures by between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius, and possibly more in the most severely affected regions. This cooling persisted for years and possibly decades. For the human populations alive at the time, the consequences were existential. The genetic evidence is extraordinary and deeply sobering. Modern humans show a level of genetic diversity that is dramatically lower than that of other great apes, including chimpanzees and gorillas, despite the fact that modern humans have a global distribution, while chimpanzees and gorillas are confined to small areas of Africa. The low genetic diversity of modern humans indicates that at some point in the past, the entire human population was dramatically reduced to a very small founding group from which all modern humans descend. Genetic analysis consistently dates this population bottleneck to approximately 70 to 80,000 years ago. The correspondence with the Toba eruption is not coincidental. The most conservative estimates suggest that the global human population after the Toba eruption may have been reduced to between 10,000 and 15,000 individuals. Some researchers believe the number may have been as low as a few thousand. The entire human species, the entire accumulated cultural and biological heritage of a lineage that had been developing for hundreds of thousands of years, was reduced to a remnant population that could fit within a small modern town. This is not metaphorical. This happened. The evidence is in our genome. Every human being alive today is descended from the survivors of a catastrophe that came within a measurement of wiping our species completely off the earth. But here is what makes the Toba bottleneck more than a story of near extinction. Before the Toba eruption, what existed? What was there that the eruption destroyed? The answer to this question is one that archaeologists have been gradually, reluctantly and incompletely piecing together, and the picture that has emerged challenges some of our most fundamental assumptions about prehistoric human capability. The standard model of human cognitive development placed the emergence of modern behavior, symbolic thinking, art, complex language, and social organization at approximately 40 to 50,000 years ago, in what is often called the Great Leap Forward, or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Under this model, humans before the Upper Paleolithic were behaviorally primitive, incapable of the complex symbolic thought that characterizes modern cognition. The problem is that the evidence keeps pushing the date back. A series of discoveries over the past 3 decades has progressively demolished the Upper Paleolithic Revolution model. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, ochre pieces engraved with geometric patterns were found dating to approximately 75,000 years ago. Perforated shell beads used as personal ornaments were found there dating to approximately 75,000 years ago. At sites in Morocco and Israel, similar shell beads and symbolic artifacts have been found dating to 100,000 years ago or more. At the site of Pinnacle Point in South Africa, evidence of shellfish exploitation and the use of ochre for symbolic purposes dates to 164,000 years ago. These finds tell us that the behavioral complexity we associate with modern humans did not appear suddenly 45,000 years ago. It was already present in some form long before the Toba eruption. The cultural heritage that the Toba catastrophe almost completely destroyed was not the heritage of primitive pre-modern humans. It was the heritage of people who were already thinking, creating, and communicating in ways we recognize as human. What was the first world, the first chapter of human civilizational development before Toba? We cannot fully answer this question because the Toba ashfall is one of the most thorough archaeological reset events in the archaeological record. The sites and materials from the pre-Toba period are rare, fragmentary, and widely scattered. We know they were there. We know they were capable of symbolic thought and complex social behavior. We know their populations spanned Africa and possibly beyond. And we know that most of them died in one of the most complete extinctions of human cultural heritage in history. The Toba bottleneck was not the end of humanity, but it was, effectively, the end of the first chapter of human civilizational development. The small populations that survived, huddled in the refugia where the volcanic winter's effects were mitigated by local geography or resources, were starting over. Not from scratch, because they carried their language, their social structures, their tool technologies and their symbolic capacities with them. But they were starting over demographically, culturally, and geographically. The first world of human development was over. The second was beginning. The recovery from Toba took thousands of years. The populations that survived the bottleneck slowly rebuilt in the refugia where they had persisted, and then gradually expanded again as the climate recovered. By approximately 65,000 years ago, populations were moving out of Africa in a wave of expansion that would eventually carry modern humans to every inhabitable corner of the globe. The world that those expanding populations built over the following 50,000 years was more remarkable than most histories acknowledge. The humans who painted the Chauvet cave in what is now France, approximately 37,000 years ago, were not primitive. The paintings at Chauvet are not childlike attempts at representation. They are sophisticated works of observational art, capturing the movement and anatomy of animals with skill that professional artists have described as remarkable even by modern standards. They demonstrate precise observation, planning, the use of perspective and shading, and the ability to represent three-dimensional forms on a two-dimensional surface. The artists who made these paintings had cognitive capabilities indistinguishable from our own. The Lascaux cave paintings, approximately 17,000 years old, show similar sophistication. The Venus figurines of the Upper Paleolithic, carved from stone, ivory and bone, show a consistent aesthetic sensibility across a vast geographic area, suggesting either long-distance cultural contact or shared symbolic traditions. Flutes made from bird bone and mammoth ivory, more than 40,000 years old, demonstrate that the people of this period had musical culture. The arrangement of burials with grave goods demonstrates belief in an afterlife or spiritual dimension to existence. But the most extraordinary discovery of this period of human development came not from cave paintings or artifacts, but from architecture. Göbekli Tepe, the site I described at the beginning of this video, was built at approximately 11,600 years ago. This date places it at the very beginning of what archaeologists call the Neolithic period, the time when humanity was first transitioning from hunter-gatherer to agricultural existence. But the sophistication of Göbekli Tepe does not reflect a society at the beginning of cultural development. It reflects a society at a peak. The excavator of Göbekli Tepe, the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who discovered the site and led its excavation from 1994 until his death in 2014, described it as the world's first temple. It may be more accurate to describe it as the world's first known monumental complex. The site consists of multiple circular enclosures, each containing pairs of large T-shaped pillars at the centre and a ring of smaller pillars around the perimeter. The pillars are decorated with bas-relief carvings of animals including foxes, boars, snakes, aurochs, cranes, ducks, spiders and scorpions. Some pillars have been found with human arms and hands carved on them, suggesting anthropomorphic representation. The effort required to build Göbekli Tepe was enormous. The largest stones weigh 20 tons. The nearest known quarry is approximately 500 meters from the site. Moving 20-ton stones 500 meters without wheels, without draft animals, without metal tools, required the coordinated labour of hundreds of people working together under some form of social organisation sophisticated enough to motivate, direct, and sustain that collective effort. And then, approximately 8,000 years ago, the builders deliberately buried the site. Every enclosure was filled with deliberate deposits of rubble, animal bones and flint tools, preserving the structures but ending their active use. Why? We do not know. But the deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe tells us that the people who built it had not simply abandoned it. They had made a deliberate decision to end its use and to preserve it. This is not the behaviour of people in cultural decline. This is the behaviour of people making a choice. The world that produced Göbekli Tepe existed from approximately 70,000 years ago after the Toba recovery to approximately 12,000 years ago. During this vast span of time, human populations grew, spread across every continent, developed the cognitive and social technologies that made civilization possible, and produced cultural achievements like the cave paintings of Europe and the monumental architecture of the Near East. This was the second world of human civilizational development. It was ended not by a single catastrophe, but by the events of a period of rapid and violent change that began approximately 12,900 years ago, and whose specific cause is still, remarkably, a matter of genuine scientific debate. The event that ended the Second World is called the Younger Dryas. If you are finding this worth your time, please subscribe and leave a like. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you are and what time it is. I always read them. Now let us continue. At approximately 12,900 years ago, something happened. Within decades, global temperatures dropped by between 5 and 15 degrees Celsius in the Northern Hemisphere, a decline as rapid as any in the geological record. The warming trend that had been underway for thousands of years, the warming that was ending the last ice age, abruptly reversed. Ice sheets that had been retreating began to re-advance. Grassland ecosystems that had been expanding contracted. The megafauna of North America, the mammoths and mastodons and saber-toothed cats and short-faced bears that we explored in a previous video on this channel, began their final decline. And the human cultures that had been thriving in the productive environments of the late Pleistocene were severely disrupted. The Younger Dryas cold period lasted approximately 1,200 years, from 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. It ended as abruptly as it began. In the Greenland ice cores, the transition from the Younger Dryas cold period to the warming of the current interglacial appears as a single abrupt shift in the chemical record. The warming at the end of the Younger Dryas raised temperatures in Greenland by approximately 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in approximately 50 years, possibly less. The cause of the Younger Dryas onset is one of the most debated questions in quaternary science. The traditional explanation is the drainage of glacial Lake Agassiz, the enormous freshwater lake that had accumulated behind the retreating North American ice sheet, into the North Atlantic, disrupting the thermohaline circulation and triggering the abrupt cooling. This mechanism is physically plausible and is supported by some evidence. But in 2007, a team of researchers proposed a more dramatic alternative. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposed that the cooling was triggered by the impact or airburst of a comet or asteroid, or the fragmentation of one over the Laurentide ice sheet covering North America. The hypothesis was supported by evidence for a platinum anomaly, nanodiamonds, cosmic spherules, and a biomass burning layer at the Younger Dryas boundary at sites across multiple continents. The hypothesis remains contested. The evidence has been challenged on methodological grounds, but it has also been reproduced at multiple independent sites by multiple independent research teams, and it has not been definitively refuted. It remains a genuine scientific debate. What is not debated is the scale of the disruption at the Younger Dryas boundary. In North America, 35 genera of megafauna disappeared within a few thousand years of the Younger Dryas onset. Every large predator was gone, as we've explored in another video. The Clovis culture, the widespread and sophisticated hunter-gatherer culture that had colonized North America within a few centuries, disappeared from the archaeological record. The specific human populations that had been building the second world of human civilization were dramatically and in many cases permanently disrupted. In the Near East, the region most relevant to the subsequent development of agriculture and cities, the Younger Dryas caused a severe drought that lasted for over 1,000 years. The lush environments of the Levant and Anatolia that had supported growing populations were dramatically diminished. Archaeological sites show evidence of population decline, site abandonment, and a reduction in cultural complexity during the Younger Dryas. The populations of the Natufian culture, who had been in the process of developing something that looked very much like incipient agriculture and permanent settlement, retreated to smaller populations in more limited geographic areas. The Younger Dryas was not simply a climate event. For the human civilizations of the late Pleistocene, it was a catastrophe, not total, not as complete as Toba, but a genuine civilizational reset that ended the trajectory of development the Second World had been following and forced a new beginning. When the Younger Dryas ended, approximately 11,700 years ago, the survivors faced a changed world. The megafauna that had sustained the hunter-gatherer economies of the previous world were largely gone. The environments that had shaped the cultures of the late Pleistocene were different, and the populations themselves were reduced and reorganized. The Third World, the world that emerged from the ashes of the Younger Dryas, would take a different path from everything that had come before. That different path was agriculture. The emergence of agriculture was not an inevitable step in human progress. It was a response to specific conditions, the conditions created by the Younger Dryas and its aftermath. The populations of the Near East who rebuilt after the Younger Dryas found themselves in a world with reduced megafauna, reduced wild plant abundance in some seasons, and growing populations competing for declining wild resources. In this context, The deliberate cultivation of plants and the management of animal populations offered a solution to resource stress. Agriculture emerged not because it was obviously superior to hunting and gathering. Studies of traditional agricultural societies consistently show that early farming involves more labour per calorie obtained than hunting and gathering in a productive environment. But because the productive hunting and gathering environment of the late Pleistocene had been destroyed by the Younger Dryas, and agriculture was the adaptation that worked in the changed world. The Fertile Crescent of the Near East, the arc of productive land stretching from the Jordan Valley through southern Turkey and across to the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys, became the first great agricultural heartland. The specific combination of wild cereals, legumes, and animals available for domestication in this region was unusually favourable for agriculture. Emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs were all domesticated in the Fertile Crescent or in adjacent regions within approximately 2,000 years of each other. And the Third World began. The transition from the hunter-gatherer world of the Second World to the agricultural world of the Third World was the most fundamental transformation in the history of human social organization. Agriculture made possible a sedentary lifestyle. A sedentary lifestyle made possible the accumulation of material wealth. The accumulation of wealth made possible social stratification. Social stratification made possible specialization of labor. Specialization of labor made possible the development of writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, architecture, law, and all the other components of what we call civilization in the narrow sense of the word. But it also made possible something else, something that hunter-gatherer societies have built-in protections against. The concentration of power, the emergence of rulers and ruled, the development of systems of extraction that allowed a small minority to live on the productive labour of a large majority, and the development of the large-scale warfare that is the inevitable consequence of states competing for resources. The Third World, the world of early agriculture and early cities, built some of the most remarkable things humanity had yet produced. The city of Uruk in what is now Iraq was, by approximately 3500 BC, probably the largest city on earth, home to perhaps 40,000 people, and the administrative centre of an economy that connected dozens of subsidiary towns and hundreds of villages across the Mesopotamian plain. Uruk gave us writing. The cuneiform script invented in Uruk approximately 5,300 years ago to record commercial transactions is the oldest writing system in the world, and from it derive, directly or indirectly, most of the writing systems that followed. Ancient Egypt gave us the pyramid, the most enduring monument ever constructed by human hands. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built approximately 4,500 years ago, was the tallest human structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. It was built with engineering precision that modern engineers still find difficult to fully explain. The largest stone blocks weigh up to 80 tons. The base is level to within 2 centimetres across a length of 230 metres. The 4 sides are oriented to the cardinal points, with an accuracy of approximately 1/20th of 1 degree. The ancient Egyptians did not leave instructions for how they built it, and the debate over the method continues. The Indus Valley civilization, contemporary with the early Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations, built cities at Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa that were, by the standards of their time, extraordinary. The cities had standardized brick sizes, They had sophisticated drainage systems that connected individual houses to citywide sewers, the first urban sanitation systems in the world. They had what appear to be public bath facilities and public granaries. They had a script that has never been deciphered, and they traded, as evidenced by artifacts with Mesopotamia and Central Asia. The Third World was the world of the first cities and the first states. It was a world of extraordinary cultural achievement, of technological innovation, of artistic production. And it was ended by a catastrophe that struck with such speed and completeness that its causes are still debated more than 4,000 years later. The 4.2 kiloyear event. At approximately 2200 BC, a severe drought began that affected a vast region from the Mediterranean to China. The drought lasted approximately 200 years. In the geological and archaeological record, it is marked by a distinctive signature of reduced rainfall, dust storms, and abandoned settlements across a huge area. Its effects on the civilizations of the Third World were catastrophic. The Akkadian Empire, the world's first true empire, which had been built by Sargon of Akkad approximately 250 years earlier, and which at its peak controlled most of the Fertile Crescent, collapsed. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire during the 4.2 kiloyear event is documented in texts and in the archaeological record. A cuneiform text from the period, the Curse of Akkad, describes drought and famine so severe that people ate their children. Archaeological surveys of the Kabur region in what is now northern Syria, the agricultural heartland of the Akkadian Empire, show that virtually all settlements in the region were abandoned during this period and were not reoccupied for 300 years. The Egyptian Old Kingdom collapsed at approximately the same time. The pharaonic state, which had been building pyramids and governing one of the most sophisticated bureaucracies in the ancient world, disintegrated into a period of chaos called the First Intermediate Period. The administrative papyri from this period describe conditions of extraordinary social breakdown. The admonitions of Ipuwer, an Egyptian text from approximately this period, describes a world turned upside down. Noblemen are hungry, the poor have become rich, the land is in turmoil, foreigners have entered Egypt. The specific conditions described correspond to what would be expected from a severe, multi-year drought disrupting the Nile's flood cycles. The Indus Valley civilization, which had been at its peak during the mid-3rd millennium BC, began its terminal decline during the period of the 4.2 kiloyear event. By approximately 1900 BC, the great cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa had been largely abandoned. The people of the Indus Valley did not disappear. They dispersed. They moved to smaller settlements in less drought-affected areas. But the urban civilization of the Indus Valley, with its undeciphered script and its remarkable standardization, was over. The Chinese archaeological record shows evidence of similar disruption during this period, including the collapse of the Longshan culture, which had been one of the most sophisticated prehistoric cultures in East Asia. The 4.2 kiloyear event did not destroy humanity. It destroyed the Third World, the civilizations that had been built by the first. Farmers and the first city builders were reduced, disrupted, and in many cases eliminated. The populations that survived rebuilt in a changed world, and the civilizations that emerged from the wreckage of the Third World were different from what had preceded them. The Fourth World was the world of Bronze Age civilization, and its collapse, approximately 1,000 years after it was built, was even more dramatic than the collapse that had ended the Third World. The Bronze Age, spanning very roughly from 3000 to 1200 BC, produced civilizations of extraordinary sophistication. By the end of the Late Bronze Age, approximately the 13th century BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was home to a network of interconnected states, operating a genuinely international economy. Egypt under the New Kingdom pharaohs was one of the most powerful and culturally rich civilizations in the world. The Hittite Empire dominated Anatolia and much of the Levant. The Mycenaean Greeks controlled the Aegean and traded across the Mediterranean. The city-states of the Levantine coast, particularly Ugarit, operated as trading hubs connecting Egypt. The Aegean, Anatolia, Mesopotamia and Cyprus in a complex commercial network. Copper came from Cyprus, tin came from Afghanistan, grain came from Egypt, wool came from the Hittites, and then, within approximately 50 years, centered on 1180 years BC, essentially every one of these civilizations collapsed. The Mycenaean Greek civilization disappeared. Every palace complex of the Mycenaean world, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, was destroyed or abandoned. The Linear B script used by the Mycenaeans, which had been a sophisticated administrative system used to manage palace economies, disappeared with the civilization that used it. The Greeks who emerged from the collapse approximately 400 years later, the Greeks of Homer and the classical period, did not even know that their ancestors had had a writing system. The memory of Mycenaean civilization survived only in oral tradition, eventually crystallized in the Homeric epics. The Hittite Empire, which had been one of the great powers of the ancient Near East and had fought the Egyptians to a draw at the Battle of Kadesh approximately 30 years earlier, completely collapsed. The Hittite capital Hattusa was burned and abandoned. The Hittite royal dynasty simply disappears from the historical record. There is no gradual decline. There is a powerful empire and then silence. Ugarit, the sophisticated trading city on the Syrian coast, was destroyed approximately 1185 BC. The destruction is documented with painful specificity. The last text found at Ugarit, written in the final days before the city fell, are letters asking for military help that never came. One letter, addressed to the king of Alashia, Cyprus, describes ships of the enemy coming from the sea. The city was apparently evacuated partially before the destruction. The kilns that were firing the last tablets were still active when the city fell. Cyprus was hit at the same time. The great copper-producing cities of Cyprus were destroyed or abandoned. Egypt was attacked multiple times by waves of migrants and raiders whom the Egyptian texts call the Sea Peoples. Pharaoh Rameses III defeated them at the Battle of the Nile Delta approximately 1175 BC, and the inscriptions commemorating his victory are some of the most important documents from this period. But Egypt itself was weakened by the effort and entered a prolonged decline. The scale of what happened at 1180 years BC defies easy explanation. Historian Eric Klein, who wrote what is probably the most comprehensive modern account of the Bronze Age collapse in his book 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, argues that it was caused not by any single factor, but by the simultaneous failure of multiple interconnected systems: climate change, drought, earthquake, internal rebellion, migration pressure, and the disruption of trade networks, all occurring simultaneously in a complex system that had become so interconnected that the failure of one part caused cascading failures throughout the whole. This system's collapse model is compelling. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean was the ancient world's first truly globalized economy. Every major state was dependent on trade for essential materials. Egypt needed tin from Afghanistan to make bronze. The Mycenaeans needed copper from Cyprus. The Hittites needed grain they could not grow in sufficient quantities domestically. When the system was working, this interdependence created enormous wealth. When it failed, the interdependence meant that the failure was catastrophic for everyone simultaneously. The Bronze Age collapse was not a local event. It was not a regional event. It was a systemic failure that eliminated virtually every complex society in the Eastern Mediterranean and severely disrupted societies across a much wider area. The populations did not disappear. They survived. But the civilization of the Fourth World was effectively ended. The writing systems disappeared in most regions. The palace economies and their administrative systems disappeared. The international trade networks collapsed. The complex social hierarchies were leveled, and the populations that survived found themselves rebuilding from a much simpler technological and organizational base. This is the pattern that recurs, not the destruction of all human life, not the complete erasure of knowledge, but the repeated catastrophic simplification of the complex systems that humanity builds by events that overwhelm those systems faster than they can adapt. The recovery from the Bronze Age collapse took approximately 400 years. The Dark Ages that followed the collapse of the Mycenaean world lasted until approximately 800 BC, when writing reappears in Greece in the form of the Greek alphabet. The Dark Ages that followed the Hittite collapse and the disruption of Mesopotamian civilization lasted similar periods, and the civilization that emerged from this recovery, the Fifth World, was different from what had preceded it. The Fifth World was the world of classical antiquity. Greece and Rome and Persia and Carthage and the Maurya Empire and the Han Dynasty. The world that produced philosophy and democracy and engineering and written history. Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, Caesar and Augustus and Hadrian, Ashoka and Qin Shi Huang, Confucius, the Buddha. The achievements of the Fifth World are the cultural foundation of everything that has come after. Western legal systems derive from Roman law. Western philosophy derives from Greek thought. The scientific method as practiced today has deep roots in the empirical traditions of classical antiquity. The religious frameworks that shape the beliefs of the majority of humanity alive today, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, in its classical form, were either founded or received their definitive form during the period of classical antiquity. And the Fifth World ended. Not with a bang, but with what the historian Brian Ward Perkins has described as one of the most dramatic and thoroughgoing transformations in human history: the fall of the Western Roman Empire. By the 5th century AD, the Western Roman Empire was under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Climate change, specifically the cooling of the late antique Little Ice Age beginning approximately 536 AD, reduced agricultural productivity across a broad region. The plague of Justinian, possibly the first great pandemic of bubonic plague, killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people across the Mediterranean world in the 6th century. The Hunnic invasions disrupted the populations of Central and Eastern Europe, pushing Germanic tribes into Roman territory in waves that the empire's military and administrative systems could no longer manage. The complex economic and administrative systems of the empire, always dependent on tax revenue that funded the military that maintained the security that allowed the economy to function, began to fail as revenue declined. the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, when the last Western Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, did not immediately feel like the end of a world. It felt like a political change, but the consequences that followed were transformative. In Britain, Roman period levels of pottery production and distribution would not be matched again for 500 years. The same pattern appears across the former Western Empire. Urban populations declined dramatically. Long-distance trade collapsed. Literacy rates fell. The administrative infrastructure that had maintained roads, aqueducts, public buildings, and legal systems disintegrated. People's lives became shorter, poorer, and more localized. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the subsequent fragmentation of the Mediterranean world into smaller, less connected, less economically sophisticated units was not as complete as the Bronze Age collapse. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years. The Islamic world, which emerged in the 7th century and rapidly incorporated much of the former Roman East, preserved and advanced considerable knowledge. But for the populations of Western and Northern Europe, the fall of Rome was effectively the end of the Fifth World. The Sixth World that followed, what historians call the medieval period, eventually rebuilt complexity from a simpler base. The cathedral building projects of the 12th and 13th centuries required engineering sophistication comparable to the monumental architecture of antiquity. The commercial networks of the medieval Mediterranean and the Hanseatic League of Northern Europe reconstructed long-distance trade. The universities of medieval Europe preserved and transmitted classical knowledge, and by the 14th and 15th centuries the foundations of the modern world were being laid. The Sixth World was ended not by an external catastrophe, but by a transformation. The Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Age of Exploration, the Industrial Revolution, these were not a collapse, but a transition from one mode of civilizational organization to another. The Sixth World evolved, through upheaval and disruption, into the Seventh World, our world. If you have been listening, this is a good moment for the second call to action. Please subscribe and leave a like, and tell me in the comments where in the world you are. Now let us turn to the question that this entire history raises. What is the pattern? What do the Toba bottleneck, the Younger Dryas, the 4.2 kiloyear event, the Bronze Age collapse, and the fall of Rome have in common? And what does that pattern tell us about where we are now? Let us go deeper into the specific evidence for each of these civilizational resets, because the evidence is more detailed and more compelling than most people realize, and the details matter. The 4.2 kiloyear event is particularly important to understand in depth, because it is both scientifically well documented and historically consequential in ways that extend far beyond the specific civilizations it collapsed. The paleoclimate evidence for the event comes from multiple independent archives. The Sorek Cave Speleothem record from Israel shows a significant reduction in rainfall, beginning approximately 2200 BC. The lake sediment records from the Arabian Sea show an increase in dust from the Arabian Peninsula during this period, consistent with severe drought. The Greenland ice cores show elevated concentrations of sea salt during this period, consistent with reduced vegetative cover in the source regions. The geographic extent of the drought is remarkable. The evidence suggests that a severe drying event affected the region from the Mediterranean to China during a relatively brief window. The mechanism is still debated, but the most widely accepted explanation involves a weakening of the summer monsoon systems that provide rainfall to the Middle East and South Asia, driven by sea surface temperature anomalies in the tropical oceans. What caused those sea surface temperature anomalies is further debated. The consequences for the Third World civilizations were not limited to the Akkadian Empire and Egypt and the Indus Valley. The Longshan culture of China, which had been producing some of the most sophisticated pottery and bronze working in East Asia, collapsed approximately 2200 BC. The civilization of the Magyayao in northwestern China, which had produced extraordinary painted pottery for almost 2,000 years, ended. In South America, the Norte Chico civilization, also known as Caral, which had been building monumental architecture in the river valleys of coastal Peru approximately simultaneously with the pyramids of Egypt, experienced its terminal decline during this period. The Norte Chico civilization, largely unknown to the general public but one of the oldest complex societies in the Americas, had developed cities, monumental architecture, and complex social organization entirely independently of Old World civilizations, and it ended approximately when the Old World civilizations ended. The coincidence of civilizational collapse across such diverse regions and such diverse cultural traditions during this relatively narrow period is difficult to explain without invoking a global or near-global stressor. A 200-year drought affecting the monsoon systems of the Old World would account for the Middle Eastern and South Asian collapses. Similar, possibly related climate events in the Americas would account for the Norte Chico collapse. The scale of the event affecting multiple independent civilizational traditions on multiple continents simultaneously is the most powerful evidence that the 4.2 kiloyear event was a genuine global civilizational reset of the kind that the pattern we are describing requires. After the 4.2 kiloyear event, the civilizations that rebuilt were different in character from what had preceded them. The Akkadian Empire was succeeded not by another Akkadian state, but by a series of competing city-states that eventually gave rise to the Neo-Sumerian period and then to the Babylonian civilization. The Egyptian Old Kingdom was succeeded by the Middle Kingdom, which was culturally and administratively different from its predecessor. The Indus Valley civilization did not rebuild. The cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa remained largely abandoned. The populations dispersed into smaller settlements and eventually contributed to the emergence of the Vedic culture of South Asia, which was in many respects a simpler organizational system than the highly urbanized Indus Valley civilization had been. This post-collapse simplification is important. The Bronze Age civilizations that built on the ruins of the Third World were not simply continuations of the previous trajectory with a brief interruption. They were new systems, built by populations who retained some knowledge from before, but who had also lost much. The specific administrative and organizational technologies of the third millennium civilizations had to be partially reinvented. The specific material culture had changed. The population distributions had changed. These were genuinely different civilizations, the Fourth World, built in the shadow of but distinct from the Third World. Now let us examine the Bronze Age collapse in more detail, because it is the best documented civilizational collapse in the record, and its specific mechanisms are most instructive for understanding the vulnerability of complex interconnected systems. The historian Eric Klein's analysis of the Late Bronze Age collapse identifies 6 factors that appear to have operated simultaneously: climate change and associated drought, earthquakes, internal rebellions, migration of the sea peoples, disruption of trade networks, and the failure of the palace economies to adapt to changing conditions. What is most remarkable about his analysis is not the identification of these factors individually, but the demonstration that none of them alone would have been sufficient to cause the collapse. It was the simultaneous operation of all of them together, their mutually reinforcing interactions, that produced the cascade. The drought evidence from the Bronze Age collapse is now well established. A study published in 2013 analysing the pollen record from the Sea of Galilee in northern Israel found a sharp decline in arboreal pollen beginning approximately 1200 BC, consistent with severe drought. Sediment records from the Gulf of Oman show elevated dust input during this period. A 2022 study analysing oxygen isotope records from cave formations across the eastern Mediterranean confirmed a significant drought affecting the region during the 12th century BC. The earthquake evidence is compelling from the archaeological record. The destroyed levels at multiple sites in the eastern Mediterranean dating to approximately 1180 BC show patterns of structural collapse, consistent with earthquake damage rather than military attack. At Mycenae, the evidence suggests an earthquake preceded the final destruction. At Tiryns, the massive Cyclopean walls show evidence of earthquake damage. At sites in Anatolia, destruction patterns are consistent with seismic activity. The Sea Peoples appear in Egyptian texts as groups of migrants from the north who attacked Egypt and destroyed other civilizations on their way. Their exact identity is debated, but the current consensus is that they were not a single ethnically or politically unified group, but a mixed population of refugees and migrants displaced by the same collapse they are often credited with causing. They were not invaders destroying a stable civilization from outside. They were, in significant part, refugees of the collapsing world of the Bronze Age, swept up in a cascade of migration and conflict that amplified the collapse rather than initiating it. The trade network disruption is perhaps the most important factor. The interconnected palace economies of the late Bronze Age had developed a degree of specialization and interdependence that left each participant vulnerable to disruption anywhere in the network. Cyprus, which supplied copper to virtually every other Bronze Age civilization, was itself dependent on tin imported from distant sources to make bronze. The Mycenaeans, who imported copper and tin from multiple sources, exported wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods. Egypt, which had its own copper sources in the Sinai, was deeply integrated into the Eastern Mediterranean trading system for timber, horses, and luxury goods. When any significant node of this system was disrupted, the effects rippled immediately through the entire network. The destruction of Ugarit, one of the most important trading hubs in the Eastern Mediterranean, disrupted the commercial relationships of every society that traded through it. The collapse of Mycenaean demand for imports reduced the income of the producers who had been supplying it. The reduction in tin supplies from Central Asia, possibly related to disruption of the overland trade routes, limited the ability of every Bronze Age civilization to produce bronze. The cascading failure of interdependent systems produced a collapse more complete than any individual stressor would have caused. The palace economies themselves were part of the problem. The palace economy was a system in which the ruler's palace controlled the redistribution of essential goods. In theory, this centralization allowed efficient resource allocation. In practice, it created a single point of failure. When the palace was disrupted by war, by internal rebellion, by the death of a ruler without a clear successor, or by economic disruption that reduced the palace's revenues, the entire redistributive system failed simultaneously. There was no alternative mechanism for distributing essential goods, because the palace economy had crowded out such alternatives. This is the point at which the Bronze Age collapse becomes most immediately relevant to the modern world. The centralization of critical systems in single points of failure, whether palace economies in the ancient world or cloud computing infrastructure, global payment networks, or concentrated food distribution systems in the modern world, creates the same vulnerability. And the solution is the same in both cases: resilience through redundancy and decentralization. Solutions that are, ironically, often resisted precisely because they reduce efficiency in the short term. The Bronze Age collapse lasted approximately 50 years. Within that 50 years, most of the complex civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean effectively ceased to exist. What followed was a period of approximately 400 years, during which the populations of the affected region lived in much simpler, smaller scale and more locally self-sufficient societies. The literacy rate plummeted, long-distance trade collapsed, urban populations declined, material living standards for most people probably fell significantly. And then the Fifth World began to emerge. The Greek poleis, the city-states that became the foundation of Western civilization, developed from the populations that had survived the Bronze Age collapse in Greece. The Phoenician trading cities that took over the Mediterranean trading roles once occupied by Mycenae and Ugarit developed from the populations of the Levantine coast. The Neo-Assyrian Empire that eventually dominated the Near East developed from the populations that had survived the collapse of the earlier Mesopotamian civilizations. The Fifth World was different from the Fourth World in its organizational principles. The palace economy was largely replaced, in the regions where it had existed, by more distributed economic systems. The city-state, with its more distributed political power, replaced the palace-centered kingdom in Greece and Phoenicia. The invention of iron metallurgy during the early centuries of the Dark Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse gave the populations of the Fifth World a technological advantage that was, crucially, more broadly accessible than bronze had been. Bronze required copper and tin, which had to be imported from specific distant sources. Iron ore was available virtually everywhere. The democratization of metal technology was one factor that prevented the Fifth World from recreating the extreme economic dependency that had made the Fourth World so vulnerable. Let us also examine what we know about the people who lived through these collapses. Because the collapses were not simply events in the archaeological record, they were human experiences. The Akkadian texts from the period of the 4.2 kiloyear drought are among the most poignant documents from the ancient world. The Curse of Akkad, composed approximately 2000 years BC to explain the fall of the Akkadian Empire, attributes the disaster to divine punishment for the hubris of King Naram-Sin, who had allegedly desecrated the temple of the god Enlil at Nippur. But the specific content of the curse is a detailed and apparently realistic description of famine and social breakdown. The text describes the abandonment of cities, the deaths of animals, the failure of crops, the breakdown of social order. It is a document of genuine social catastrophe, filtered through the theological framework of its time. The Egyptian admonitions of Ipuwer, from the first intermediate period that followed the collapse of the Old Kingdom, is similarly striking in its specific detail. The papyrus describes a world in which the established social order has completely inverted. Those who had servants now have none. Those who had no bread now have grain. The river is blood. Laughter has perished. The land turns like a potter's wheel. These are not abstract theological complaints. They are descriptions of a social world in which the systems of distribution and authority that ordinary people depended on had completely failed. The archive of tablets from Ugarit recovered from the rooms where they had been fired in the kilns at the time of the city's destruction contains letters that read almost like dispatches from a modern crisis zone. A letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia describes enemy ships, enemy fleets, 7 ships of the enemy that have been sighted. He asks for military assistance. The letter was never sent. The city was destroyed before it could be dispatched. The letter of a subordinate official to a senior official describes the situation as extremely serious, with the enemy burning the cities and doing great damage. Another official writes that there is no grain in our possession. These are real human beings in real crisis. The bureaucratic language of the Bronze Age administrative tradition through which we know these people masks the emotional reality of what they were experiencing, but the emotional reality is there in the desperation of the requests, in the specificity of the threats described, in the letters that were written but never received because there was no one left to receive them. The pattern of civilizational collapse is not an abstraction. It is what happens to people. It is the specific, individual, personal experience of the world you knew ending, of the systems you depended on failing, of the skills that had value yesterday having no value today, of the knowledge that the generation before you took for granted being lost because there was no one left to transmit it and no one to receive it. Every civilizational collapse in our record created populations of survivors who were, by the standards of the world before the collapse, impoverished. Not necessarily materially, though often that, but intellectually and organizationally. The specific complex knowledge required to maintain the systems of the collapsed civilization was lost, because those systems no longer existed to teach it and reward it. The scribes of the Bronze Age knew how to manage a palace economy. In the Dark Age after the collapse, there were no palaces to manage, and so no scribes to manage them. The loss of knowledge in civilizational collapses is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of the pattern. We tend to think of knowledge as permanent once it is recorded, but in societies without writing, knowledge is maintained by practice. When the practice ends, the knowledge ends with it. And in societies with writing, the writing is only as permanent as the institutions that maintain it. When the institutions collapse, the writing on which they depended becomes inaccessible or meaningless. The Linear B script of the Mycenaean world disappeared completely with the Bronze Age collapse. Linear B was used by palace administrators to record inventories, transactions, and allocations of labour and goods. When the palaces were destroyed, there was no one who needed to read Linear B and therefore no one who transmitted the skill of reading it. When writing reappeared in Greece 4 centuries later, it was an entirely different system, the Phoenician-derived Greek alphabet, learned from contact with the Levantine trading world. Linear B had to be rediscovered, painstakingly, by the scholar Michael Ventris in 1952, more than 3,000 years after the last person who could read it naturally had died. What was lost between those 2 points is unknowable. The specific administrative knowledge of the Mycenaean palace economy, the specific ritual and religious knowledge that the Linear B texts addressed. the specific technical knowledge of Mycenaean shipbuilding, bronze working, textile production, and the other technical arts of the Bronze Age world. Some of this knowledge survived in modified forms, transmitted through the Dark Age in practical traditions of craftsmen and farmers. But much of it was lost, permanently. This is the specific tragedy of civilizational collapse, not the destruction of buildings which can be rebuilt, not the death of individuals who would have died eventually anyway, but the destruction of knowledge, the specific, accumulated, painstakingly developed knowledge of how to do things, of how the world works, of what has been tried and what has been learned. This knowledge takes generations to accumulate. It can be lost in years or decades. The question of what knowledge from previous worlds might have survived and been preserved in the myths, traditions, and unconscious practices of the civilizations that came after is one of the most fascinating and most contested questions in the study of ancient history. The flood myths deserve special attention in this context, because they appear in the traditions of virtually every human culture on Earth, on every continent, and because the pattern of their content suggests they encode a genuine historical memory. We explored flood myths in depth in a previous video on this channel, but in the context of the seventh civilization, they deserve revisiting with a specific focus. What is it that every major flood tradition is trying to preserve? The core narrative is always the same. A previous world existed and was destroyed by water. A small group of survivors preserved the essential knowledge and biological material of the previous world. A new world was rebuilt from that preserved knowledge and material. The survivor is typically the most righteous or the most wise person in the previous world, selected by a divine power that understood what was coming. The psychological and mythological dimensions of this narrative are multiple and complex, but the historical core is consistent with what the geological and archaeological record actually shows. A previous world, the second world of sophisticated hunter-gatherers, was severely disrupted by the Younger Dryas and associated events that included significant flooding as ice sheets melted and sea levels rose. The survivors of that world preserved what they could of its knowledge and traditions. The new world that was built, what we have called the Third World, was built in part on that preserved knowledge. The Sumerian king list, which is one of the most important documents from the early 3rd millennium BC, explicitly describes the world before the flood as one of kings who ruled for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years each. After the flood, the kings rule for merely human periods of centuries and decades. The list draws a clear line between the antediluvian world, the world before the flood, and the post-diluvian world, the world after. The Sumerian conception of the antediluvian world as one of extraordinary wisdom and longevity is not primarily a historical record, but it is a cultural memory of loss, the awareness that what exists now is an impoverished version of what came before. The emotional truth encoded in the impossibly long reigns of the pre-flood kings is the conviction that the world before the flood was qualitatively superior to the world after it. This conviction is not confined to the Mesopotamian tradition. The Hindu concept of the Kali Yuga, the current age of moral and intellectual decline, is set against the backdrop of previous ages of greater human capability and spiritual connection. The Greek tradition of the Four Ages, gold, silver, bronze, and iron, describes the current age as the most degraded in a progressive decline. The Book of Genesis describes the Nephilim, the great ones who existed before the flood, as beings of extraordinary power and possibly capability. Every human civilization of which we have records has preserved some version of the awareness that the world was once different and once better. This is not nostalgia for a fictional golden age. It is, in the deep structure of the tradition, a cultural memory of the multiple resets that have punctuated human civilizational development. A memory that the world we inhabit is not the first world that was built, and that the worlds that came before it were, in some respects, that were genuinely valuable, more than what we now have. There is one more dimension of this story that belongs here before we close: the question of what the civilizations before the Younger Dryas actually knew. The standard model says essentially nothing. Pre-agricultural, pre-writing, pre-urban humans had no significant organized knowledge. They were behaviorally modern in cognitive capacity, but had not yet developed the technologies of knowledge storage and transmission that allow complex knowledge to accumulate across generations. But Göbekli Tepe challenges this assumption directly. The people who built Göbekli Tepe had to have had sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The specific orientation of the structures at Göbekli Tepe and the specific animals carved on the pillars has led some researchers to propose that the site was used for astronomical observation, and that the specific arrangement of carvings encodes information about star positions and possibly astronomical events. This interpretation is contested, as most interpretations of Göbekli Tepe are, because the site is so far from anything in our standard models of prehistoric capability that every interpretation requires significant extrapolation from limited evidence. But the broader point stands. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were operating with a degree of social organization, collective purpose, and accumulated knowledge that we have systematically underestimated. They were not at the beginning of their development. The precision of the constructions, the consistency of the iconographic program across multiple enclosures spanning centuries, the sheer scale of the coordinated labor required, all point to a tradition that was well established before the earliest structures we have found. What was at the beginning of that tradition? When did it start? How far back does it go? We do not know, but we know that the Younger Dryas ended it, or severely disrupted it, 11,700 years ago. The people who survived the Younger Dryas and began building the Neolithic cultures of the Near East were working with reduced populations in changed environments with the knowledge that could be preserved through the crisis rather than the knowledge that had existed at the peak. Göbekli Tepe may represent the last expression of that pre-Younger Dryas knowledge. Built 11,600 years ago, at almost exactly the moment when the Younger Dryas ended and the Neolithic began, it may be a monument built by the last generations who still carried the full tradition of the Second World, before the transition to agriculture and the population growth of the Neolithic diluted and eventually replaced that tradition with different knowledge suited to different circumstances. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe, which puzzles archaeologists who try to explain it in purely practical terms, may make most sense as a cultural act of preservation. A choice to bury what was built, to protect it, to ensure that it survived, made by people who understood that what they had built would not be maintained by what came after, that the world was changing, that the knowledge that had built Göbekli Tepe would not survive in the population that agriculture and cities would produce. If this interpretation is correct, the builders of Göbekli Tepe knew they were the end of something. They buried their achievement to preserve it, and it survived for 11,000 years until archaeologists in 1994 discovered it and began to understand how much it upended everything we thought we knew. let us now spend time with the specific geographic evidence that makes the pattern of civilizational disruption most visually concrete. Because the ruins of these previous worlds are literally beneath the ground on which we walk. In Istanbul, the ancient city of Constantinople, archaeological excavations conducted during the construction of the Marmaray Metro tunnel between 2004 and 2013 revealed an extraordinary layered record of human occupation. Below the Byzantine levels, below the Roman levels, below the Hellenistic levels, the archaeologists found a Neolithic port settlement dating to approximately 6,000 years BC. This settlement was built at the edge of what was then a shallow freshwater lake. It is now 35 meters below the surface of the Bosphorus Strait. The lake it stood beside was the early Black Sea, before the proposed flooding event we have discussed in a previous video. The people who built that Neolithic port did not expect the water to come. The preservation of their settlement was so rapid and so complete that the archaeologists found wooden structural elements still in their original positions, organic materials including seeds and nuts, and the skeletal remains of their domestic animals. These are not the remains of a city abandoned by choice. These are the remains of a community that was overwhelmed. In the English Channel between England and France, the floor of what was once the fertile Doggerland Plain lies under approximately 30 to 50 meters of North Sea water. We have discussed Doggerland in another video, but in the context of the 7th civilization, Doggerland deserves mention as one of the most concrete pieces of evidence for the kind of world that existed before the current one. Fishing trawlers regularly pull up the bones of mammoths and the tools of Mesolithic hunters from the seafloor of the North Sea. The landscape that was once home to thousands of people now lies under the sea. The communities that lived there did not leave voluntary records. They left the tools and bones that chance has preserved. In the Persian Gulf, which was a river valley during the last ice age, and a fertile, productive environment inhabited by substantial human populations, there are submerged traces of human habitation on the floor of the modern Gulf. The shallow depth of much of the Persian Gulf, which was entirely above sea level until approximately 8,000 years ago, means that the archaeological record of its Pleistocene inhabitants may be recoverable by underwater archaeology. What has been found so far is limited, but the potential is extraordinary. The sea level rise that followed the end of the last ice age, which raised global sea levels by approximately 120 meters over several thousand years, inundated an enormous area of previously habitable and previously inhabited land. The total area submerged is approximately 27 million square kilometers, which is approximately the size of North America. This submerged land was not unpopulated. It was some of the most productive coastal and riverine environment available to Pleistocene humans, and virtually all of the archaeological record of the people who lived there now lies under between 10 and 120 meters of water. This is the physical reason why the Second World left so little trace. Its most productive and most populated environments were drowned. The terrestrial record of the late Pleistocene hunter-gatherer world is necessarily biased toward inland and upland sites that were above the rising sea level. The full record of what the Second World was, concentrated as it would have been on the coastal plains and river deltas that now lie underwater, is largely inaccessible. The implications are significant for the question of how sophisticated the Second World actually was. If sophisticated sites like Göbekli Tepe existed in the upland interior of Anatolia, What existed on the coastal plains of the eastern Mediterranean before those plains were flooded? We cannot answer this question from the archaeological record we currently have, because the record is mostly underwater. But the question itself deserves to be taken seriously. The answer may be significantly more interesting than our current models assume. There is an important aspect of the mythology dimension that deserves more careful examination: the myth of Atlantis. Plato described Atlantis in two dialogues written approximately 360 years BC, the Timaeus and the Critias. According to Plato, Atlantis was a great island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is to say beyond the Strait of Gibraltar in the Atlantic Ocean. It was extraordinarily powerful and sophisticated, and it was destroyed in a single day and night, sinking beneath the ocean in a catastrophe sent by the gods as punishment for the Atlanteans' moral corruption. The conventional view among classical scholars is that Atlantis is a philosophical fiction invented by Plato to make a political argument about the dangers of imperialism and moral corruption. This interpretation has much to recommend it, given Plato's consistent use of fictional dialogues to make philosophical points. But the Atlantis story has persistent features that complicate the pure fiction interpretation. Plato presents the story as received historical tradition, transmitted through Egyptian priests who claimed to preserve records from 9,000 years before Plato's time. That would place the original event approximately 9,400 years before the Common Era, which is approximately 11,400 years ago. This date corresponds with striking precision to the period of the Younger Dryas ending and the subsequent rapid sea level rise. Whether Plato invented the story, received a garbled tradition of actual events, or was working with genuine records from Egypt, the specific date he gives corresponds to one of the most dramatic periods of environmental and civilizational disruption in the record. The location of Atlantis, in the Atlantic beyond Gibraltar, is consistent with the geography of the late Pleistocene, before the sea level rise that followed the Younger Dryas. The continental shelves of the Atlantic were exposed during the last ice age. The Azores platform and the area around the Azores Islands, which sit on a shallow submarine plateau, would have been substantially larger above sea level before the rise. The coastal areas of southwestern Europe and northwestern Africa, which Plato's geographical descriptions are somewhat consistent with, extended further into the Atlantic. I'm not arguing that Atlantis was real in the specific way Plato describes it. I'm arguing that the specific date Plato gives, the specific description of a maritime civilization destroyed by sinking beneath the ocean, and the preservation of the story in Egyptian records that claim to go back 9,000 years, together constitute evidence that Plato was working with genuine tradition rather than pure invention, even if that tradition had been greatly elaborated and mythologized over the millennia of its transmission. What is beyond dispute is that the late Pleistocene world included populations living on coastal plains that are now underwater. Those populations were sophisticated. They had been developing culturally for tens of thousands of years, and the flooding of their coastal homelands, which occurred in pulses over several thousand years as the ice sheets melted, was experienced as catastrophic by the people who lived through it. The Atlantis myth may be the most famous cultural memory of the Second World's End, but it's far from the only one. Every culture that has a flood myth is encoding the same cultural memory in a different form. The specific details differ, the theological framework differs, the name of the survivor differs, but the core narrative, a world before the flood, a catastrophe, of water, a survivor, a new beginning, is universal. This universality is itself evidence, not evidence that there was a single global flood that all cultures remember, but evidence that the experience of coastal flooding during the terminal Pleistocene was widespread enough and dramatic enough to leave a permanent imprint on the cultural traditions of the populations who experienced it. Those populations then carried the memory of the experience through all subsequent cultural changes, mythologizing and transforming it, but never entirely losing the core, that there was a world before and the water took it. The evidence for the pattern of civilizational collapse is strongest when looked at from the longest perspective. From within any individual collapse, the causal story looks different. The Bronze Age collapse looks like a military and political crisis. The fall of Rome looks like a political and military crisis. The 4.2 kiloyear event looks like a climate crisis. The Younger Dryas looks like a climate and ecological crisis. But from the outside, from the perspective of 10,000 or 70,000 years, the individual causes are less important than the pattern they share. Complex human civilizations, whether they are the informal social complexity of sophisticated hunter-gatherers or the formal organizational complexity of palace economies and empires, are vulnerable to disruption by forces they cannot control, and the vulnerability increases as the complexity increases. The Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek observed that the knowledge required to run a complex society is distributed across millions of individuals, each of whom knows things that no central authority knows and could not know. The market mechanism in his analysis is a way of aggregating this distributed knowledge through price signals. But the flip side of this observation is that the distributed knowledge that sustains a complex society is deeply vulnerable to the disruption of the social systems through which it is transmitted. When the social system is disrupted, the knowledge disperses or disappears. This is what the Bronze Age collapse demonstrates most clearly. The specific knowledge required to maintain a palace economy, to organize the long-distance trade networks, to manage the diplomatic relationships between states, to read and write the administrative scripts, was distributed across a relatively small community of specialists. When the systems those specialists worked within collapsed, the specialists dispersed or died, and the knowledge went with them. The dark ages that followed were dark not because the population was less intelligent than before, but because the specific organizational knowledge of the Bronze Age palace economy was lost, and there was no way to reconstitute it quickly from the simple societies that survived. The parallel to the modern world is direct and uncomfortable. The specific knowledge required to maintain the global supply chains that stock modern supermarkets and factories is distributed across a small community of specialists in logistics, manufacturing, procurement, and finance. The specific knowledge required to maintain the digital infrastructure on which modern civilization depends is concentrated in a very small number of highly trained individuals and institutions. If those systems were severely disrupted, the specific knowledge required to maintain them would not be automatically preserved or recoverable. This is not an argument for pessimism, it is an argument for what engineers call resilience by design. The awareness that complex systems can fail, and that the failure of complex systems tends to destroy the specific knowledge that maintains them, argues for deliberate investment in redundancy, in distributed knowledge, in the preservation of older and simpler technologies, alongside newer and more complex ones, and in the kinds of social and institutional structures that allow knowledge to survive disruption. Every civilization that has survived and recovered from a collapse has done so because some knowledge was preserved through the collapse. The survivors of the Bronze Age collapse preserved enough agricultural knowledge, enough bronze working technique, enough social organization, enough oral tradition that the Fifth World could be built. The survivors of the fall of Rome preserved enough of the classical tradition through monasteries and through the Islamic world and through the Eastern Empire that the Sixth World could recover. The question for the Seventh World is not whether it will face challenges comparable to those that ended previous worlds. The pattern suggests it will. The question is whether, knowing the pattern, it can preserve more of its knowledge and organizational capacity through the inevitable disruptions than its predecessors did. That is the most important question that the history of the seven civilizations raises, and it does not have a comfortable answer. But it does have an actionable one. The pattern is complex and multidimensional, but several elements appear consistently across the collapses we have examined. The first element is environmental stress. Every major civilizational collapse in the record we have examined was accompanied by, or preceded by, a period of environmental disruption. The Toba eruption caused a volcanic winter. The Younger Dryas brought rapid and extreme climate cooling. The 4.2 kiloyear event brought severe and prolonged drought. The Bronze Age collapse coincided with a period of drought that has been documented in the pollen records and sediment cores of the Eastern Mediterranean. The fall of Rome coincided with the late antique Little Ice Age and its associated agricultural decline. This does not mean that environmental stress alone causes civilizational collapse. It does not. The specific mechanisms through which environmental stress translates into civilizational collapse vary with the structure of the civilization being affected. Which brings us to the second element, systemic fragility. Every civilization that collapsed in our survey was at or near its peak of complexity at the time of collapse. The Akkadian Empire was at its greatest extent when the 4.2 kiloyear drought struck. The Bronze Age Mediterranean civilization was at its most interconnected when the Late Bronze Age collapse occurred. The Roman Empire was at or near its maximum extent when the stresses of the 5th century began to accumulate. This is not coincidence. Complex systems are in some respects more fragile than simple ones. They have more points of failure, they have more dependencies, they require more maintenance. And when they fail, the failure tends to propagate through the system rapidly. The economist and complexity theorist Joseph Tainter has proposed what is perhaps the most elegant framework for understanding civilizational collapse. His argument, developed in his 1988 book The Collapse of Complex Societies, is that societies invest in complexity as a problem-solving strategy. More complex organizational structures solve problems that simpler structures cannot. But complexity has diminishing returns. Each additional increment of complexity costs more to maintain and produces less additional benefit than the previous increment. Eventually, a society reaches a point where the investment required to maintain its existing complexity exceeds the returns that complexity generates. At that point, the society is vulnerable to collapse even from relatively modest external stresses, because it lacks the surplus to absorb shocks. Tainter's model helps explain why civilizations tend to collapse at their peaks, rather than in their declines. A civilization at its peak has maximized its complexity, and is therefore operating at the point of minimum marginal returns. A small additional stress, which it might easily have absorbed at an earlier stage of development, can be enough to trigger a cascade of failures. The third element is interconnection. Civilizations that were more interconnected and trade-dependent were more vulnerable to cascading collapse than those that were more self-sufficient. The Bronze Age Mediterranean world, which had reached an extraordinary degree of economic interdependence, experienced a more complete collapse than any of the individual societies within it would have experienced in isolation. When the trade networks failed, every society in the network failed simultaneously, because every society had become dependent on the network for essential materials. This observation has obvious resonance for the modern world. The degree of economic interconnection in the current global economy far exceeds anything that existed in the Bronze Age. A disruption to global supply chains for semiconductors affects the production of automobiles, medical devices, and military systems simultaneously across every nation. A disruption to global financial systems transmits almost instantaneously to every economy on Earth. The interconnection that makes the modern economy extraordinarily productive also makes it extraordinarily vulnerable. The fourth element is the speed of collapse relative to the speed of adaptation. In every collapse we've examined, the speed at which the disrupting force operated exceeded the speed at which the civilization could adapt. The Toba eruption produced conditions lethal to most human populations before those populations could relocate or modify their behavior. The Younger Dryas cooling occurred faster than agricultural or cultural adaptation could compensate. The Bronze Age collapse disrupted trade networks before alternative supply chains could be developed. This observation matters because one of the main arguments used to dismiss concerns about civilizational vulnerability is that human societies are adaptive. They are, but adaptation takes time, and if the rate of change exceeds the rate of adaptation fails. Now let us talk about where we are, not to alarm, but because the pattern demands honesty. We are the seventh world. The first world of human civilizational development was ended by Toba 74,000 years ago. The second world of sophisticated hunter-gatherers whose achievements we are only beginning to understand was ended by the Younger Dryas 12,900 years ago. The third world of the first agriculturalists and the first cities was ended by the 4.2 kiloyear event 4,200 years ago. The fourth world of Bronze Age civilization and the first international economy was ended by the late Bronze Age collapse approximately 3,200 years ago. The fifth world of classical antiquity was ended by the fall of Rome and the subsequent fragmentation of the Mediterranean world approximately 1,500 years ago. The sixth world of the medieval and early modern period transformed through the scientific revolution and industrial revolution into the seventh world. We are the seventh world, and we face simultaneously the same categories of stress that ended every previous world. We face environmental stress. The climate change driven by greenhouse gas emissions is altering temperature, precipitation, and extreme weather patterns at rates that the archaeological record suggests are comparable to or exceeding some of the most disruptive natural climate events of the past. The 4.2 kiloyear event, which collapsed multiple Bronze Age civilizations, involved a drought that lasted approximately 200 years. The current trajectory of climate change on current emission paths projects temperature increases over the next century comparable to those that have preceded major civilizational disruptions in the geological record. We face systemic fragility. The global economy of the 21st century is at a peak of complexity that dwarfs anything that has existed before. The just-in-time supply chains that stock grocery stores and factories across the world leave almost no buffer against disruption. The financial systems that underpin the global economy are interconnected in ways that allow failures to propagate globally within hours. The digital infrastructure that modern civilization depends on for everything from payment systems to food distribution to communications is concentrated in a small number of physical nodes that are themselves vulnerable. We face interconnection vulnerabilities, the same interconnection that makes modern civilization extraordinarily productive, makes it extraordinarily vulnerable to cascading failure. A pandemic originating in one region can spread globally within weeks, as the world demonstrated in 2020. A disruption to a major shipping choke point can affect the global supply of essential goods within days. A cyber attack on critical infrastructure can disable systems across multiple countries simultaneously. And we face the problem that our current civilization, like every civilization that preceded it, has not fully internalized the lesson of the pattern. Every previous civilization believed, in the context of its own knowledge and assumptions, that it was the final achievement of human development. The Romans did not believe that the world they had built would end. The Bronze Age elites of the Eastern Mediterranean did not believe that their interconnected world was fragile. The builders of the Akkadian Empire did not believe that drought would destroy everything they had created. They were all wrong, not because they were stupid or negligent, but because the pattern of civilizational collapse is not visible from within the civilization being collapsed. It takes the long view, the view from outside time, to see the pattern. We have that view. The question is what we do with it. Let us return to Göbekli Tepe one more time, because it represents something more than a remarkable archaeological discovery. Göbekli Tepe is proof that the model of human development we've been using is wrong. The model said that complexity comes from agriculture. Göbekli Tepe proves that complexity preceded agriculture. The model said that monumental architecture requires a state. Göbekli Tepe proves that monumental architecture can be produced by non-state, non-agricultural societies. The model said that the hunter-gatherers of the Pleistocene were essentially primitive, that all the real development came after. Göbekli Tepe proves that the people of the Pleistocene were building things that we have not yet fully explained, using social and organizational technologies that we do not fully understand. What does this mean for the question of the seventh civilization? It means that every time we have thought we understood the depth of human history, we have found that it goes deeper. Every time we've established a boundary beyond which human sophistication did not exist, the evidence has moved the boundary back. The cave paintings at Chauvet are 37,000 years old. The symbolic artifacts at Blombos are 75,000 years old. Göbekli Tepe is 11,600 years old and builds on a tradition that clearly goes much further back. We're probably not in any rigorous sense the seventh civilization. The number 7 is a useful metaphor for a pattern, not a precise count. The actual number of times human civilizational development has been disrupted and forced to rebuild is probably larger than 7. Some of those disruptions left almost no recoverable trace, because they occurred before writing, before large-scale architecture, before the archaeological signature we use to identify civilization. They are visible only in the genetic record, in the isotopic record of ice cores and cave formations, in the indirect traces of population size and distribution preserved in the DNA of modern humans. But the pattern that the metaphor points to is real. Human civilization has been disrupted before, multiple times, by catastrophes that were overwhelming and that forced rebuilding from a reduced base. The world we inhabit is built on the ruins of worlds that came before it. Some of those ruins are literal, buried under the cities we have built. Some are cultural, preserved in the mythological memories of floods and golden ages and sunken kingdoms that appear independently in the traditions of every civilization we know of. And some are genetic, preserved in the specific pattern of low diversity that every human genome carries as evidence of the bottleneck that almost ended us 74,000 years ago. We are not the first, we are the latest, and we carry within us, in our genomes and in our mythologies and in the ruins beneath our feet, the accumulated evidence of everything that came before. Here is what the ancient myths are telling us. In almost every culture that we have records of, there is a story of a golden age before the current one. The Sumerians had a myth of 8 kings who ruled before the Great Flood, each with extraordinarily long reigns, who were wiser and more capable than the kings who came after. The Hindus have a cycle of 4 ages, the Yugas, in which the current age, the Kali Yuga, is the most degraded, and the ages before it were progressively more enlightened. The Greeks had a tradition of 4 ages of humanity, gold, silver, bronze, and iron, in which each age was inferior to the one before. Genesis speaks of the Nephilim, great ones who existed before the flood. These traditions are not historical records in any modern sense. They are cultural memories filtered through centuries of oral transmission and mythological elaboration, of the awareness that something was lost, that there was a world before the current one that was different, and possibly in some respects superior, and that something happened to it. The specific details of these traditions are not reliable guides to historical reality, but the fact that the awareness of loss, this sense of a before and an after, a world that was destroyed and a world rebuilt in its shadow, appears independently across cultures that had no contact with each other, is significant. It reflects a genuine historical reality encoded in cultural memory, the reality that civilizations do end, that what is built can be destroyed, and that the world the survivors inherit is always a reduced version of the world that was lost. We are the inheritors of everything that has been lost. Every collapse that preceded the current world narrowed the channel through which the accumulated knowledge and achievement of humanity passed. Every reset reduced the sophistication of the surviving baseline. We're building on the ruins of the Bronze Age, which was built on the ruins of the first cities, which were built on the ruins of the late Pleistocene hunter-gatherer world, which was built on the ruins of everything that preceded the Younger Dryas, which was built on the ruins of what Toba destroyed. We are not the culmination of human history. We are the latest attempt. And everything that was lost before us, everything that was built and destroyed in the worlds that preceded ours, left traces in the myths, in the ruins, in the genes, and in the patterns that we are only now beginning to read. Before we reach the synthesis, let us be precise about what the 7th civilization framework is and what it is not, because precision matters when dealing with evidence that touches on some of the most sensationalized topics in popular history. The 7th civilization framework, as I have described it in this video, is an analytical framework for understanding the pattern of civilizational disruption that the archaeological, geological, and genetic record actually documents. It is not a claim that there were literally 6 previous advanced civilizations with technology comparable to or exceeding modern technology. There is no evidence for such civilizations in the scientific record. The geological record is clear. The Earth would have preserved far more trace of a technologically advanced civilization than we find. No plastics, no synthetic materials, no refined metals beyond what naturally occurring geological processes produce, no artificial radiation signatures. The record is clear on this. What the record does show is that human cultural and organizational sophistication has been repeatedly disrupted by catastrophic events, and that each disruption resulted in a loss of knowledge and organizational capacity that took centuries or millennia to recover. The sophistication that existed before each disruption was real, but different in character from what we imagine when we say advanced civilization. The second world of sophisticated late Pleistocene hunter-gatherers was sophisticated in ways we are still learning to recognize, but it was not technologically advanced in the modern sense. The third world of the first agricultural civilizations was extraordinary by the standards of what came before it, but it was not technologically advanced in the modern sense. What makes the seventh civilization framework valuable is not a claim of literal technology, but the recognition that human civilizational development is not a straight line, that the complexity we have built is not permanent, that the forces that disrupted previous civilizations are still operating, and that the pattern of disruption followed by survival, followed by rebuilding, is one that we have repeated multiple times, and that we'll probably repeat again. That is the honest version of the seventh civilization story. It is grounded in real evidence. It does not require the invention of lost continents or the suppression of alternative history. The real history, as revealed by the actual archaeological, geological and genetic record, is already extraordinary enough to justify the kind of wonder and reflection that the best versions of this story aim to produce. We have survived Toba. We have survived the Younger Dryas. We have survived the 4.2 kiloyear event. We have survived the Bronze Age collapse. We have survived the fall of Rome. Each time the survivors rebuilt. Each time what came after eventually reached and in many respects exceeded what had existed before. The pattern of civilizational collapse is real, and so is the pattern of civilizational recovery. The seventh civilization is real, and so is its resilience. The honest conclusion of this story is not a comfortable one. It is not a prediction of doom, because the record also shows that humanity is extraordinarily resilient. We survived Toba. We survived the Younger Dryas. We survived the Bronze Age collapse. We survived the fall of Rome. Every time the survivors rebuilt. Every time what came after eventually reached or exceeded the sophistication of what had been destroyed. But the record also shows that the collapses were real, that the losses were real, that the people who lived through them experienced the end of the world they had known, that the knowledge and the cultural heritage and the specific achievements of the worlds that ended were lost, permanently and irretrievably in most cases. We do not know what the people of the Second World had learned in the 50,000 years of their development. We have fragments. We have cave paintings and shell beads and the shadow of Göbekli Tepe. But most of what they knew, most of what they had built in the way of cultural and perhaps technological knowledge, died with them in the Younger Dryas and its aftermath. The lesson of the seventh civilization is not that collapse is inevitable. It is that collapse is possible, that the complexity we have built is not self-sustaining, that the interconnections that make us powerful also make us vulnerable, that the environmental stresses we are generating are of the kind that have preceded every major civilizational disruption in the record, and that the pattern demands acknowledgement. We are the seventh world. The sixth worlds before us built remarkable things and lost most of them. The question is not whether we can be the last. History suggests we will not be. The question is what we choose to learn from the pattern, and whether that learning makes any difference. The ruins of every previous world are beneath our feet. The myths of every previous loss are in our stories. The genetic evidence of every near extinction is in our genomes. We are the inheritors of everything that was lost, and the trustees of everything that exists now. What we do with that inheritance is the only question that matters. Let it settle around you quietly. The weight of what came before, the worlds built and lost, the people who lived in those worlds, who loved and feared and built and believed, and whose works were reduced by forces they could not control to the fragments we have spent centuries trying to read. They were not failures, they were us. The same cognitive hardware, the same drives and fears and capacities for wonder and love and creation. They built what they could with what they had, in the world they inhabited. And when their worlds ended, the survivors of their civilizations carried forward what they could, the knowledge compressed, the cultural memory encoded in myths, the genetic inheritance of bottlenecks survived. We are the latest chapter of the longest story. We carry everything that was saved from everything that was lost. What we build now, and whether it stands or falls, will be another chapter in a story that neither began with us nor will end with us. The seventh civilization continues. Sleep well.